Give me 1 second because I want to do it on Facebook too. Continue. I don't see it here anymore. All right. So we're getting some attendees populating. We'll give it a second. Just welcoming everyone. Hello, hello, hello. If you're able to hear me well, type in a yes for me.
What about the background?
Perfect. I see some yeses coming through. Okay. So we'll give it about 30 more seconds to allow folks to come on in.
Screen good.
Okay, we're getting ready to get started. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this afternoon program. I am Dr. Ajama Wogu, the Associate Director for the Multicultural Center with the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. We invite you to certainly stop by the Multicultural Center. We're on College Way across the street from Humanities, I believe. We are practicing social distancing here at the center, if you were wondering. I just welcome you for this afternoon session for this webinar where we will be exploring the Confederate flag and where it comes from. So the format for this gathering is to hear from Dr. Yarbrough, and throughout this program you are invited to raise your hand or use the raise the hand feature, and I will perhaps call on you and enable you to join, and you could unmute yourself so that you can engage directly with Dr. Yarbrough. A second option, if you prefer, is to use the Q&A feature to ask questions throughout this engagement. So if possible, try to type in direct questions for Dr. Yarbrough. We ask this because it can become a bit challenging to try to find the question if it's padded with comments that you may feel inclined to include. So we understand that, but again, just try to keep it direct. Now I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Faye Yarbrough. Dr. Yarbrough is an associate professor of history at Rice and the visiting editor for the Journal of Southern History. She studies American Indian history, African American history, and Southern history. So I'm thrilled today for Dr. Yarbrough to speak with us about the flags of the Confederacy, because while we're able to recognize the flag when we see it, there's so many facts related to it that are explored in our society. So with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Yarbrough.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to have a chance to talk to you. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen with you because there's a PowerPoint, and I have some announcement about events that are coming up through the School of Humanities that you might be interested in as well. And I'm gonna go ahead and apologize ahead of time. We are doing our day 2 of virtual school at home, and I have 2 kids, and I've put a note on the door for them not to come in, but all bets are off on what's gonna happen with day 2 since we had so much trouble yesterday. All right, so let me attempt to share my screen with you. I'm gonna click that and then start our slideshow. All right. So again, before we get started, I wanted to let you know about some events that are coming up tonight at 6 p.m. There is an event with Brian Washington, sponsored in part through the Center for African and African American Studies. So I wanted to let you know about that. You can see the address at the website if you would like to register for that webinar. We also have a list of other upcoming events that I want to let you know about. So one is Which Lives Matter, Race and Policing in France and Beyond, which will be on September 25th. The speakers are actually going to be from France, and they're going to be participating in the webinar. There's Conversations in Environmental Studies with Planet Now, that's September 14th. And then we're going to have reflections on the 2020 election with Douglas Brinkley, CNN presidential historian, and that is going to be October the 1st. And more information about that, how to register for that webinar, is also going to be forthcoming. So these are some of the big events that we have through the School of Humanities. So what I want to do today, oh, I'm sorry, here's the Brinkley flyer. What I want to do today is give you a bit of a primer, I would say, about the origins of the Confederate flag, and to discuss a little bit of what it means. Obviously, there's been a lot of renewed interest in recent years in the display of the Confederate flag, and also re-examining the many monuments to the Confederacy that we have here in the United States. And in the wave of public protests after the killing of George Floyd, we saw more intense pressure to take a lot of those monuments down. And again, also a re-examination of where the Confederate flag is flown and what it means and why it continues to be flown in a lot of places. So we see more Americans now questioning why those monuments are in public spaces, and under what circumstances those monuments were created, and why we fly the flag. Though I have to add, I think for a lot of African Americans, it isn't only now that they've been asking these questions that we've been wondering, why do we continue to have these images and monuments here in the United States? So some recent controversies of the flag that I'm sure you're all aware of. So in Mississippi, just this summer, the state of Mississippi's legislature voted to remove the Confederate flag from the state flag. Here we have an image of that. And they have not yet decided on its replacement. So technically the state of Mississippi currently has no state flag. The move was prompted, many would argue, in part by Black Lives Matter protests. Another factor that I think we can't ignore is that there are many businesses, religious organizations, and in particular the SEC and the NCAA saying that they would no longer have tournament events in the state of Mississippi if they continue to have the Confederate flag on the state flag. So I think, to the surprise of a lot of people, the state legislature voted to remove this. But of course, the present moment isn't the only moment in which states have thought about the place of the flag and whether or not they were going to continue to fly it. So of course, I think we will all remember that in South Carolina, the state legislature removed the Confederate flag from the dome of the Capitol after self-identified white supremacist Dylan Roof entered a Charleston church, Emmanuel AME church, and murdered 9 African-American worshipers in 2015. I think what you might not know is that there is a group of supporters of the South Carolina secessionist movement who continue to return to the Capitol every year on July 10th to put the Confederate flag back up and to also play the music Dixie and to give lots of speeches. And I have to add here that the Confederate flag had been on display at the Capitol in South Carolina from 2000 to 2015, not from 1865 to the present, which might be the perception that you would have. It's from 2000 to 2015 that the South Carolina state legislature decided to fly the Confederate flag there. And then another controversy is with the Georgia state flag. Again, a little bit older still. So Georgia changes its state flag, which included obviously the Confederate flag prominently displayed. And note the dates of when they made this change to add it in the first place. It's 1956, in the wake of the passage in the wake of the Brown v. Board of Education decision. So it's really a response to the fact that the Supreme Court said that Southern states had to integrate schools, that the Confederate flag suddenly becomes really popular again in the state of Georgia. And so again here, they take the flag down in the early 2000s. They removed the Confederate symbol from the flag in the early 2000s, partly in response to intense pressure from, again, business people. Because after the city of Atlanta hosted the Olympics in '96, there were a number of visitors, especially from abroad, who came to Atlanta and were really shocked to see that the Confederate flag on the state flag and so brazenly displayed everywhere. And so it was in the wake of that that a lot of business people pushed for the Confederate flag to be removed from the state flag because they were concerned that they might be losing business opportunities, that companies might not want to join to open offices in Atlanta, to do business in Georgia with this symbol on the state flag. So I want to back up, right? So these are more recent controversies. Again, I tell you about Georgia and Mississippi in particular, South Carolina in particular, just to re-emphasize that it's not just in 2020 that people have been thinking about the flag, but that it's a longer history of people questioning its display. But I want to back up and think and ask this question: where does the flag that we all think of as the Confederate flag come from? So I don't think we need to rehash the causes of the Civil War and its consequences. I think we're all well aware of that. Suffice it to say, I'm going to say that the Southern states secede in order to protect the institution of slavery. We can talk about states' rights, but I'm going to argue that yes, Southern states are interested in states' rights when they have to do with the protection of slavery, and that Southern states are quite fine with the federal government exercising authority over them, over other states, when it's in the interest of the protection of slavery. So our big example of that, of course, is the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law, which is a federal law. States like Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama are happy for the federal government to enforce the Fugitive Slave Law because it protects the institution of slavery, and they argue that the federal government has power over state governments when it's in the interest of protecting slavery, right? So we're not going to argue about that. So we have the Civil War, and here is where we start to see these different flags emerge. So here are the examples of the flags that you're probably most familiar with, right? These Confederate battle flags. The Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of Tennessee. So this is a moment where I would say to folks, do you notice anything different about the two flags? Are these exactly the same? I don't know that I can see all of you in the chat.
And you're welcome to indicate your response in the chat section. We do have a question as you were speaking in the Q&A section.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
I can't see the Q&A. Well, but maybe I can make the Q&A happen. So is that group trying to get the flag back up at the Capitol for the secession of South Carolina from the United States? Yes. If so, do we know why they're from? I mean, the folks who are coming every year to put the flag up are South Carolinians who want to have the flag back prominently displayed at the state capitol, for sure. So to point out this difference between these two flags, right? The shape is different, and also you see the Tennessee flag has Tennessee locations on there, and I point out that there are these two different kinds of flags to say that initially all these Confederate battle flags aren't the same for all of the states. States are, of course, modifying it to look like, to emphasize things that they want to emphasize. Again, to add these locations in Tennessee, for instance. And battle flags can vary from state to state, but also can vary from unit to unit. Again, if you think about states seceding and striking out on their own, one of the things that they're emphasizing is their individual identity as states. And so these units have their own flags, their own emblems, etc. So we have these examples of some of these early battle flags. A lot of people think that these flags are based on the British Union Jack, the X part. That some of you might find ironic, given that the United States had separated from Great Britain. It wanted to be a separate nation from Great Britain, but then that some Southerners would turn to Great Britain for symbols to use as they're trying to secede from the federal government, right? I mean, it's interesting that they would choose an image from a political system that they no longer wanted to be a part of in the past, but suddenly they're adopting parts of it again. So if we want to think about national flags for the Confederacy, we have some examples of those as well. So this is the first national pattern, right? So this first flag of the Confederacy that we can see here from March of 1861, and then each star represents a seceding state. And there are several iterations of that flag. As more states secede, then they add stars to this circle part of the flag. Then we'll see this move by May of 1863 to this second national pattern, again, also referred to as the stainless banner. Here, if we could be more interactive, I would be asking you to say, any potential problems with a big white flag with only an emblem in the corner during a time of war, right? So this looks a little bit too much like a surrender flag, right? A white surrender flag. So the Confederate government quickly says, this is a bad idea. We can't have this big white flag that we're taking into battle that looks like we're surrendering. It's too confusing. And this initial flag, actually, even though there are several iterations of it, some of the soldiers say looks too much like the regular American flag, and that it's too confusing to recognize opposing troops when you're in battle if these flags are too similar. So they take that stainless banner and they then call it the bloodstained banner, and they add this big red stripe to make it more clear that this isn't a flag of surrender. And then there's this other flag that I think we could argue is actually the first Confederate flag and might be the one for, if your interest in the flag is about heritage, then this might be the one that you actually should be flying, because it's one of the earliest flags that we know of for the Confederacy. This is called the Bonnie Blue flag. It's first flown by Mississippi when the people accept the Ordinance of Secession. And they raised this flag over the Capitol building in Jackson, and it gets the name the Bonnie Blue flag because there's a Irish actor named Harry McCarthy who's there and sees the flag raised and writes this song called the Bonnie Blue flag, right? And part of what this flag represents is, right, the stars on the flag represent each state, and here's one state leaving the Union, and so this is what this flag represents. So it's called the Bonnie Blue flag. Sometimes it's referred to as a Lone Star flag. I think we're in a state in which we know about a Lone Star flag. So I think the connections between this flag and the Texas state flag are interesting to ponder. And this flag actually has an even earlier use in 1810 that has to do with conflict between Spanish authorities, French authorities, and the people who are living in the southwestern part of what will become the United States. So again, I would argue that if you are really interested in heritage and thinking about Confederate ancestors who served in the war, that this might actually be the most accurate flag for you to fly, right? Because this is one of the earliest flags that we have to represent that. Then there are other flags that we could also think about. So here are two allies of the Confederacy, the Choctaw Nation and the Cherokee Nation. And they had their own flags that they flew as a part of the Confederacy, right? And so if you want to talk more about Choctaw and Cherokee participation in the Civil War, I'm happy to do that in the Q&A part, right? So again, I just want to give you a sense that there are a wide variety of potential flags that we could talk about and think about when we think about the Confederacy and flags that represent the Confederacy. But we have placed all of our emphasis on the particular Confederate battle flag. So I also want to show you one last flag, set of flag pictures to think about, right? So I mentioned earlier that the state of Georgia removes the Confederate battle flag from their state flag in the early 2000s, and they adopt this for their Georgia state flag. And next to it is one of these early Confederate national flags. And I think they look remarkably familiar. And I don't think that's by accident. And I put them out for you so that you can think about how we sometimes focus on one particular symbol to represent the Civil War and the Confederate States of America. But in focusing on that, we lose sight of the fact that there are other symbols and the other symbols are being deployed. And so I firmly believe that when this state of Georgia adopted this state flag, they know that it has this connection to this older Confederate national flag. But this Confederate national flag from the past doesn't raise the ire of people in the same way as the Confederate battle flag, right? So they can adopt this flag kind of under the radar and still hearken back to a Confederate past without raising the attention of the public and raising the alarm or protest of the public in adopting this flag. I wonder about the state of Mississippi when they adopt a new flag, what it might look like. Might they hearken back to one of these older Confederate flags, these Confederate national flags, and get rid of the Confederate flag to appease the SEC or the NCAA, but still keep the Confederate flag in another guise that's less familiar to people and so doesn't raise concern and attention in the same way that that battle flag does. So the last thing that I want to say about this, because I hope we're going to have a good, robust conversation, is that I think we should all think about when we're talking about taking down the flag or taking down monuments, taking down these symbols, we should also really think about consequential change, because there's a way in which, I'm not saying that we shouldn't take these symbols down, and I'm not saying that these symbols don't have meaning to people, but there's a way in which it's easy for the state of Georgia or the state of Mississippi to remove that symbol. There's a way that that's easier than taking action to promote real change in terms of how people of color are treated in their states or in the United States as a whole, in terms of real institutional inequalities that exist, right? That if we focus too much on the symbol, I think sometimes we lose sight of the real work that has to happen if we want to see changes in this country with regards to race relations. And the second thing that I want to point out, that I hope by showing you these different flags at different periods and pointing out when they suddenly appear at the state capitol or are reinscribed onto state flags, is that they are in response to particular events. And they are clearly telegraphing to populations particular meanings, right? So we cannot say that these flags, as soon as the war ended, suddenly make their appearance in state capitals and make their appearance on state flags. Instead, and we can't even say that as soon as Reconstruction ends that these flags make their appearance. It's actually later, and again, I think in response to specific events and to send specific messages to state populations, to the wider United States, in the case of the state of Georgia, to say a specific thing about how they feel about Brown v. Board of Education and school integration. All right, so that's it for me. I hope that we can have a little bit of conversation about the flag and the flag as an image and what it represents. All right.
Great, thank you for that awesome insight. So what I'd like to do now, if you will, you're welcome to not share your screen here.
Oh, yes.
And we do have a question here in the Q&A. So shall I encourage that person to join us, or would you like to answer the question directly?
I would love for them to join us.
Okay.
I'd love for Pamela to ask us.
So perhaps, Pamela, would you like to join us live? Let me see how I can do that. And you can indicate that in the chat if you will. Let's see. Got the chat up, got the Q&A up.
I don't know if Pamela wants to elaborate on that. Oh.
Okay, so you're welcome to,
yeah, let's go ahead. So no, I wouldn't say that you should assume that anyone who flies the Confederate flag is racist. I think in today's context, people associate all kinds of different meanings. So I'll give one example. I used to teach at the University of Oklahoma. And when I was teaching there, there was a brouhaha among the students because at one of the dorms, someone decided to fly out of their window a very large Confederate flag so that whenever you walk past the dorm, you would see this big Confederate flag. And we were in class and actually in the African American History Survey, and the question of this flag came up, and the students said, well, what does this mean? What are they doing? And so I asked the students, I said, what do you think it means that they fly this flag? And one of the young men in the class said, I know the person who's flying that flag. And he sees it as a symbol of rebellion, right? That for him, the meaning was, right, it's the rebel flag, right? So for him, it was this complete, it was a symbol of not following the rules, that I'm not, that I'm bucking the system, that I'm brave enough to go to chart my own course, to go my own way. And so I think there are lots of people who take the flag today, and when they display it, they are thinking of, in particular, I would say, about rebellion and not being someone who's willing to go against the norm, to being a more independent spirit. And so, the young man who explained this, he said, so he doesn't think it's racist at all. And I said, okay, all right, I understand that that's what he thinks. I said, but he shouldn't be surprised if the response from people is to feel like it does signal that he's being racist because of the history of the image, right? So he can display it and think whatever he thinks about his display of it. But it's, as I said to my students, but he can't tell the rest of us what we think or imagine when we see it. And I said, so, if I'm alone in my car and I'm driving and somebody pulls up behind me and they have a big Confederate flag on their car, does it make me anxious? Yes. Do I know that they have that displayed because they have racist thoughts about me or any other person of color? I don't know that, but does it make me anxious and make me feel like, okay, well, let me, be on my way? So I don't think we can assume. I hope I'm answering your question, Pamela. I can assume that the person who displays it has racist intent, but I would encourage them to look at the history of how it's been displayed, when it's been displayed, again, that it's deployed at these really specific moments in the past to express a particular feeling, again, against the practice of the desegregation of schools, or at other moments. I almost showed you guys an image now of a heavily armed person who was at an event patrolling Black Lives Matter protests, and he had on the Confederate flag as a bandana as he was walking around with his very large weapon. I think there are people who are going to be at those protests and see that as indicating a very specific thing, and I don't know that he's not attempting to indicate a specific thinking about race when he decides to deploy that, right? In 2020, it's hard to imagine that folks are completely unaware of some of this symbolism that's there connected to the flag. So again, can we assume that every person who displays it is racist? No, I think we can say that they are provocative.
And maybe uneducated.
Well, yes, and maybe unaware of this.
Or unaware, uneducated, yeah.
Yeah, of this history. Again, because I think if you really wanted to be, I'm a historian, right? If you wanted to be accurate, it's the Bonnie Blue flag that you ought to fly if you're going to be really accurate about it. Or at least that first national flag with the stars in a circle.
Right, I can see that about the rebellion, though. I get that. But we were just on a trip to Arkansas, and I just saw quite a few of the Confederate battle flags, and it just kind of shocked me. I thought, wow, there's many more than I had would have anticipated. So, I thought about going up to somebody's house. I thought, no, I don't want to do that.
I don't want you to do that either, Pamela. I don't want you to do that.
Ask them, do you know, what does this mean to you? And maybe under the right circumstances, that would be a good question to ask somebody. Just depends on the circumstances.
Yeah, what does it mean to you, right? Yeah. And I think you will more often than not get this explanation about rebellion, not being a blind follower. And then also, especially in the Deep South, you will get comments about ancestry, right? That they're doing it to honor their relative who participated in the war and fought for the Confederacy.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I've got to bug off. So thanks so much for taking the question.
You're welcome. Let's see.
I was muted. I was speaking. Sorry. We do have a question in the chat that I don't want to miss, and then we're going to jump right to the Q&A. The question is from Antoinette. It reads, what is the relationship of the flag with the Ku Klux Klan or other nationalist and or racist organizations?
Yeah, so it's clear that there are a lot of organizations who, whether other folks think that the flag is a symbol of racism, there are lots of avowedly racist organizations who certainly display the flag, right? So there are racist organizations, they're not confused about the meaning of the flag, and will use the flag precisely to strike fear in target populations, and people of African descent. If we remember, the Klan is also opposed to immigrants, Catholics, right? All kinds of groups, Jewish people. So they're targeting all those people with that imagery. But yes, there are certainly, again, avowedly racist organizations who display the Confederate flag and certainly mean it to frighten people and to associate with racist ideas.
Okay, great. So the next question in the Q&A reads from Sophia, what effect do you have in changing the flag? I'm sorry, what effect do you think changing the flag will have? Is it worth the trouble? Is it solely performative? Is it a symbol of change?
So again, I don't want to minimize the effect of changing the flag. I don't want to minimize the importance of symbols. I would never have guessed that the state of Mississippi would have been willing to remove the Confederate flag from the state flag. I would not have bet money on that in 2020. So I think it is a symbol of something changing in the state of Mississippi. And I think the symbols are powerful when, if you're part of a group that understands the Confederate flag to symbolize racism, there is something that changes when you can go to the Capitol and you don't see that flying there anymore. Clearly, it had an effect on those visitors to the Olympics in Atlanta who came and said, whoa, what is this? Why do you guys have this on the state flag? It clearly gave them ideas about what they were walking into when they came to Atlanta to watch the Olympics. So I don't want to minimize the importance of the symbols. What I want to stress is that you can change symbols and also pursue real systematic change in people's lives, that you shouldn't stop at the changing of the symbol, but that you should keep moving forward and think about, okay, what are the inequities in education that we can address? What are the ways that institutional racism is at work and is affecting people's lives on a daily basis, right? So that we don't stop at the imagery. And again, there's a way in which the imagery part is easy, so why wouldn't they change it, right? There's a way in which deciding to take the flag down, that's an easy first step that you can make to signal to people that you're willing to start thinking about these things differently and to pursue change. So I don't think I don't want us to let state lawmakers, for instance, do it only as performance, right? Because that's a wonderful question, Sophia, right? That you don't want it to be solely performative. You want there to be lasting change with it. I just really want to emphasize to people that we need to keep it the desire for lasting systemic change as well, not only being satisfied with the removal of a symbol, because that's the easy part, right? It's we want to push for bigger change. I hope I'm answering your question.
That was perfect. That was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Let's see.
Okay, thank you, Sophia, for your question. The next question reads from an anonymous attendee, you mentioned flags of Native tribes in association with the Confederacy. Were there any Native tribes that fought on the side of the Confederacy? If so, what were their motivations for their allegiance with the Confederacy?
Okay, well, as it so happens, I just finished a book, writing a book about Choctaw Confederates, and my first book is on race and the Cherokee Nation. Both of those Native nations sided with the Confederacy during the Civil War. In fact, the so-called 5 civilized tribes, Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, sided with the Confederacy during the war. And these are all also slaveholding nations. So these are tribes that held slaves who were people of African descent. So that certainly is a part of their decision to ally with the Confederacy. And part of what I argue is that another factor, a very important factor for them, is that so in the present moment, when we talk about Southern states saying things about states' rights, we know that many of us anyway, many historians, many scholars talk about that states' rights as code for protecting the institution of slavery. For Native nations, I think they were taking the idea of states' rights and drawing a connection to Native sovereignty And I would argue that they thought that the Confederate States of America were going to protect sovereignty and respect Native sovereignty. And the Confederate States of America sent emissaries to Native nations almost immediately upon secession and promised that they were going to respect sovereignty, and also promised everything in the financial reward, that they would pay for the troops to arm the troops, to clothe the Native troops that were going to fight on the side of the Confederacy. So I think it's a combination of those things. They have that shared interest in the institution of slavery. Native nations have a vested interest in protecting Native sovereignty, and Southern states are promising to do that. There are a lot of connections financially, because a lot of money for these tribes that was paid for land cessions was invested in Southern states and Southern businesses, so they see a financial tie. The federal agents that they sent to work with Native groups were also often Southerners as well, so they, were pressuring them as well. And then there's a lot of connection between Native populations and Southerners in terms of other business interests. So for instance, there's a Choctaw slaveholder, Robert Jones, who goes to New Orleans all the time to do business, right? So he's, doing business with white Southerners and purchasing and selling slaves and other goods in New Orleans. So there are all this web of connection that's making an alliance with the Confederate States of America make a lot of sense for these Native groups.
Awesome. Thank you for that question. The next question is from Victoria. It reads, how should states and communities like universities deal with offensive symbols such as flags and statues while still educating people about what happened in the past? How do you think that Rice should proceed with the Willie statue?
Oh, Victoria, you're asking a tough question for someone who's also a Rice alum. And I know Victoria from class, so I wouldn't expect anything less from Victoria. So the more general question, and if people didn't catch the Confederate monuments and statues webinar that Rice hosted earlier in the summer, I would highly recommend that you take a look at that. So one of the things that came out in that conversation that I thought was really important is that it was Annette Gordon-Reed. Actually, I've watched multiple monument things, but there's a different one that's with Annette Gordon-Reed, and she talks about whether the person is being honored for something else in the statue, or if they're being honored solely because of their participation in the Civil War, their participation as a Confederate officer, for instance, in the Civil War. And so she was making a distinction between founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson and then other folks like Robert E. Lee, right? And so part of her argument was that if there's someone who was there, who is being honored because they helped found the nation, then that's different than someone who's being honored on Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia, because they actually fought against the nation and participated in the Civil War and wanted to uphold the practice of slavery. So I think that's a good distinction. I liked how she thought of that. In terms of Willie's statue, I think sometimes when we, again, I'll go back to this idea of thinking only about the symbol and not about the change, right? So if we want to see changes happen at the university, if there are things, policies that you see at the university that you think disadvantage groups, and you want to see that change, I would rather put my energy into that than into a symbol, than into the statue, if you see what I mean, right? So that I would want to see that us put our energy into that, because it would be too easy for an institution like Rice to say, okay, well, we've gotten rid of the statue for you, and so now you can't complain about other stuff, right? If you want these other changes to happen. So whatever the other changes are, if you want, I don't know, and that's the problem, is that the changes that we seek are often more difficult than the removal of the symbol. So if you want more outreach to high schools with more lower income students, right? That's the thing that you want, then you should push for that. If you want more faculty of color, then you should push for that, right? So that I think it's often too easy to focus on the symbol rather than these other things that will have more lasting consequences and make greater change for the students and the faculty and the staff here at the university. So that's my non-answer to what to do about Willie's statue in particular. Right? I mean, that's the, go ahead, Victoria, because I can see you're on there.
No, I thought that was a great answer, because I do agree with what you were saying about saying like, oh, removing a statue, that's easy to do. We can get rid of that. And now we don't have to worry about, you know, what, like the actual institutional issues dealing with people of color at the university. So I think that was a great answer. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Good to hear your voice. Well, if I may turn to be a little perhaps too political, I think it's also in the same way that there have been, after the election of Barack Obama as president, there was this, oh, but we've elected a Black president, so that racism isn't a problem in the United States anymore. We don't have to think about that anymore. And I hope many of you would agree that that's not true. And so, you know, it's that, which is not to minimize the importance of having Barack Obama serve as president. Clearly that image, that symbolism is incredibly important, right? But it also is easy to then say, well, and we're done. We don't have to do other harder things to address other bigger problems in the country, because we did that. So we can't be, you know, because we're post-racial now. We don't have to think about that now, right? So it's the bigger changes that I think are harder to achieve. And again, as I say, sometimes I feel like if we focus too much on the symbols and the images, we then lose sight of the bigger changes that we want.
That's awesome. Well, thanks for answering my question. I totally agree with that. I think that's a wonderful approach and definitely very effective.
Thank you, Victoria, for your participation. Okay. The next question we have here is from an anonymous attendee. It reads, even if people may not have racist intentions, shouldn't they be aware of its message to other people and how unsafe it makes other people feel because of its history?
Oh, I would love for people to be taking all kinds of history classes so that they could learn more about the history of this image and to be aware of how the effect that it has on other people. I will say that I think for some people who deploy this particular image, how unsafe it makes other people is precisely the point, right? For some people, that is what they want, is that they are letting you know how they feel and what they think about people of color, or again, Catholics or Jewish people, or right, like there is a, you know, I don't want to dismiss the fact that there is a population for whom the racist meaning is precisely the meaning that they intend to convey to people. But yes, I would love it if more people knew more about the image and how it's been used, and the feelings that it engenders. But there are, you know, I used to teach at the University of Kentucky, and when I was there was a controversy because there was a high school student who had hand sequined her prom dress, and it had the Confederate flag on the prom dress, and the school wouldn't let her wear it to prom. And she sued the school district, and there were organizations that came to her aid to raise the money to sue these. And the most interesting thing about the whole situation to me was, so she said she wanted to wear this Confederate flag prom dress to honor her ancestors. So multiple things. Kentucky is a border state, and so they did not side with the Confederacy. So that's number one. Number two, someone did some genealogy for her, and her ancestor fought for the Union. So it was this, there was a moment where I thought a little more information, a little more education for you would have been really helpful, because maybe you would have made different choices about what you were doing and why you were fighting so hard to be able to wear this dress.
Great, thank you. Okay, the next question is from Anzi. How do you respond to a person who believes that the Civil War was fought for reasons not related to slavery, and that this flag is more than a symbol of support of a racist institution?
So what I have done in class, I teach it at Rice sometimes as well, but I also at the University of Oklahoma taught the Civil War class. And sometimes I would call it my come to Jesus moment with my students. And so I would ask, give me all of the reasons that the South fought the Civil War that don't have to do with slavery. And so they would list a lot of reasons, and then we would go through each one, and I would show its connection to slavery, right? So for instance, the South is more agricultural and the North was industrializing. Okay, it was more agricultural based on what kind of labor? Why, how was the South more agricultural? Aha, slavery. Folks would say, well, it's a different climate in the South compared to the North. And then I would say, do you think they fought a war because it was a different climate in the South versus the North? So I think for me in the classroom, it's often letting folks give all of their reasons, and then we go through each one and see, okay, does this make sense as a reason for why they fought in the Civil War? A, and then B, can you come up with a reason that isn't connected to slavery? And I remember even one year a student said, are we going to come up with anything that's not connected to slavery? And I said, I don't know, are you? Are you going to, this is you telling me the reasons. So that's a thing that happens in the classroom. I think probably, Anzilla, are you thinking more about personal interactions with people? Because that's tougher, right? Like I can say what I do in a classroom, but in personal interactions, I think it's a lot harder to change a person's mind. And I can't even say that I necessarily change the minds of my students when they talk to me in class. But Anzilla, if you want to elaborate on that at all.
No, I was just curious to see what someone who has an education in history might say. This was a personal interaction with a pretty good friend, but he says some things sometimes that make me go, where did you go to school? But what my response to him wasn't, what he makes me do is he makes me go re-educate myself. So my response to him was I went home and I read the declarations of cause. And then I went back and I said, have you ever read that? You should read it. Because his response was, well, states' rights. And I was like, states' rights to do what? But then I asked him to read that. But that was my response. But I think what you did was kind of the very similar thing to what I did. I was just looking for another reason.
Yeah.
Texas actually had another reason.
Say that again, please.
Texas did have another reason.
Oh, because they want to be separate from the rest of the country?
No, it was about Native Americans, and that the country was not protecting them from the Native Americans. That was their other reason for wanting to secede.
Yeah, but again, I would still say for Texas, slavery is a big part of it. And it's really interesting because other Southerners from places like Mississippi and Alabama at the time comment on the ferocity of Texas support for the Confederacy. And even for other Southerners say, wow, those Texans are super into into secession and the Confederacy. I mean, it's a funny, Texas is always doing its own interesting thing, but Texas also has that reputation among other Southerners. And Texas is also one of the places they have these people called Red River Raiders who go into Indian Territory and try to get the natives to side with them in the war. So that's yet again another moment where I would say, yeah, they say that they're worried about depredations by native populations. And granted, the native populations that they're trying to get to support them aren't the same ones that they're worried about. However, they also, if the natives are potential supporters of slavery, are all about joining them and getting them to side with them in the war. So even for that explanation, so this is a moment where I would say in class, so even for that, there's still, slavery connects people in ways that other things don't, right? And slavery is a unifier in terms of Southern sentiment about the war in ways that other things don't. And another thing that you could point to with your friend is the cornerstone speech by the Vice President of the Confederacy, which is all about how slavery is the cornerstone of the Confederate nation, right? He's pretty clear about the centrality of slavery to what the Southerners are doing in terms of secession.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Angie. Okay, we have a couple more questions, and there was a comment from Miller Wright. He said Texas seceded from Mexico because of slavery. Okay, so perhaps we could take one more quick question. I'll leave it up to you to decide which question you want to answer. Are you able to see them?
I can see them. So the first is, do you think there is a connection between calling those tribes the 5 civilized tribes and their slaveholding status during the Confederacy? They are called the 5 civilized tribes because they're seen as the ones that are doing the most to emulate whites, and adopting the institution of slavery as a part of that emulation. Accepting missionaries and converting to Christianity is another part. There are tribal members who are sent to go to school in southern states, right? So this education and literacy and English and all, that's another part. So yes, the quick answer to that is yes. And then I'll just say really quickly about the Confederate flag's rise after Obama's election. I haven't done any research on the ubiquity of the flag or increased use of the flag, but my suspicion is that yes, it probably did go up again, because just in terms of my own observations while I was in Oklahoma after the election, is that I certainly saw more flags after he was elected than before. And I think it was deployed as a symbol to say something about people's unhappiness about an African-American man being elected president of the United States. I think they were sending a clear message about how they felt about that.
Awesome, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, well, we are at the 1:30 mark. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Yarbrough, for your talk on the Confederate flag. Thank you all for your wonderful, insightful questions. Please know if you have any questions related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion is here to support any of those programmatic needs or any of those conversations. There's also the Office of Multicultural Affairs that is available. So make sure you reach out to these different parties. I did drop a link to the survey. Please be sure to complete that. It takes approximately 90 seconds to complete, if you will. So please complete that for us. And please look out for more programs this month and into next month, throughout the whole semester, throughout the whole year, from the Multicultural Center. So thank you all for joining in today. Just wishing you a wonderful week. Take care,
Thank
everyone.
you. Do you need to do anything else, Jonah?
No, thank you so much. That was beautiful and wonderful. Thank you so much.